April 1957. The corner of 116 Street and Lenox Avenue in Harlem was a location where multiple worlds intersected, where the Italian mob's interests in narcotics and gambling met the black-controlled numbers operations that Bumpy Johnson had managed since 1935, where legitimate businesses operated alongside illegal enterprises, where community residents navigated between cooperation and resistance to various forms of organized crime. On weekday afternoons in spring, the corner was moderately busy with people moving between errands, workers returning home from day shifts, children playing near stoops, vendors selling newspapers and cigarettes from small stands. At 3:45 on this particular Wednesday afternoon in mid-April, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson stood on the northwest corner of 116 and Lenox. Observing activity in the neighborhood is part of his routine practice of maintaining awareness of developments that might affect his operations. Johnson was 51 years old, a man of average height wearing a dark suit despite the warm April weather. He had controlled Harlem's numbers rackets for more than 2 decades, operating under an agreement with the Italian mob that gave him independence in exchange for sharing profits. As Johnson stood on the corner, a young man approached from the east, walking quickly up 116 Street from the direction of 3rd Avenue. The young man appeared to be in his mid-20s, well-dressed in a gray suit, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who had a specific destination. His appearance suggested Italian heritage, dark hair, olive complexion, features common among the Italian-American population in East Harlem, which bordered the predominantly black neighborhood where Johnson operated. Behind this young man, approximately half a block back, 2 other men followed. They were also dressed in suits, also appeared to be Italian, also moved with purpose. But their movement patterns suggested they were following the first man rather than simply walking in the same direction. They maintained consistent distance, adjusted their pace when the first man slowed or accelerated, kept their attention focused on him rather than on their surroundings. Johnson recognized this pattern immediately. He had observed enough surveillance and pursuit operations over his decades in criminal activity to identify when someone was being followed with hostile intent. And the 2 men behind were not casual pedestrians who happened to be walking in the same direction. They were following the young man in front deliberately, likely planning to act against him when circumstances provided opportunity. The young man being followed reached the intersection of 116 and Lenox and stopped, appearing uncertain about which direction to proceed. He looked around as though trying to orient himself, suggesting he was unfamiliar with this neighborhood. This hesitation allowed the 2 men behind to close the distance, moving to within approximately 20 feet. Johnson observed this development with professional interest, but without initial intention to intervene. The situation appeared to involve Italian mob business, which was separate from Johnson's operations in Harlem's black community. Johnson had survived and prospered partly by understanding when to involve himself in conflicts and when to remain apart from situations that did not directly affect his interests. But as the 2 men closed distance on the young man at the intersection, one of them reached inside his jacket in a motion that Johnson recognized as accessing a weapon. The other man moved to position himself in a way that would block escape routes if the first man drew his weapon and moved to attack. These movements indicated that violence was imminent, likely within the next 30 seconds. The young man being followed appeared to notice the 2 men for the first time. He turned to look at them directly, and his expression changed from uncertainty about navigation to fear about immediate danger. He stepped backward, creating distance. But his movement brought him closer to the curb, where traffic moved along Lenox Avenue, limiting his escape options. Johnson made a decision that was instinctive rather than calculated. He walked quickly across the sidewalk to position himself between the young man and the two pursuers. He did not draw a weapon or make threatening gestures. He simply stood in a location that blocked the two men's approach, creating an obstacle that would require them to acknowledge his presence and to decide whether to proceed with their intended action despite his interference. The two men stopped. They looked at Johnson with expressions that showed recognition. They knew who he was, understood his position in Harlem's criminal hierarchy, recognized that his intervention represented a complication to whatever they had planned. One of them said something in Italian that Johnson did not understand, but the tone suggested frustration and uncertainty about how to proceed. Johnson said nothing. He simply stood between the young man and his pursuers, maintaining a calm expression, keeping his hands visible to show he was not preparing to draw a weapon, but also keeping his stance balanced in a way that suggested he was prepared to defend himself if necessary. The two men exchanged looks, conducting a silent conversation through facial expressions and small gestures. They appeared to be evaluating their options: proceed with the attack despite Johnson's interference, withdraw, and attempt to pursue the young man later when Johnson was not present, or engage Johnson directly to remove his interference. None of these options appeared attractive to them, and their uncertainty about which to choose gave the moment a quality of suspended tension where multiple outcomes remained possible. After approximately 20 seconds that felt longer, the two men turned and walked back east on 116th Street, reversing their previous direction, abandoning their pursuit of the young man. They walked quickly without running, maintaining dignity while clearly withdrawing from the situation that Johnson's interference had complicated. Johnson watched them until they turned south on 3rd Avenue and disappeared from view. Then he turned to look at the young man he had protected without fully understanding why he had chosen to intervene. The young man was breathing quickly, adrenaline response to the realization that he had been close to serious danger. And he looked at Johnson with an expression that combined gratitude and confusion, grateful for the intervention, but uncertain about who Johnson was and why he had helped. Johnson asked the young man who he was and why two men had been following him with apparent intention to cause harm. The young man hesitated before answering, clearly uncertain whether Johnson could be trusted with information. But the fact that Johnson had just prevented an attack suggested that Johnson was not aligned with whoever had sent the two pursuers, so the young man decided to provide at least partial explanation. He said his name was Michael Costello. He was the son of Frank Costello, the crime boss who had until recently controlled the Luciano crime family before being challenged by Vito Genovese. He had been visiting a friend in East Harlem when he noticed he was being followed. He had walked west into Harlem, hoping to lose his pursuers in an unfamiliar neighborhood, but instead had found himself in a location where he did not know how to navigate or where to seek help. Johnson understood immediately the significance of what had just occurred. He had intervened in an assassination attempt ordered by Vito Genovese against the son of Frank Costello. This intervention placed Johnson in the middle of the violent power struggle between two Italian mob bosses, a conflict that had been escalating over the previous months and that threatened to destabilize organized crime operations throughout New York City. The situation represented both danger and opportunity. The danger was obvious. Johnson had interfered with a Genovese operation, which could be interpreted as taking Costello's side in the power struggle, which could create retaliation against Johnson or his organization. But the opportunity was also significant. Johnson had potentially saved the life of Frank Costello's son, which created a debt that could be leveraged into political capital within the Italian mob hierarchy. Johnson told Michael Costello to come with him. He walked with the young man north on Lenox Avenue to 125th Street, then west to a restaurant on 7th Avenue, where Johnson sometimes conducted business meetings. He directed Michael to sit in a booth in the back of the restaurant and to wait while Johnson made telephone calls to determine how to address the situation that his intervention had created. Over the next hour, as Michael Costello sat in the restaurant booth drinking coffee and trying to process how close he had come to being killed, Johnson made a series of calls from a payphone in the restaurant's back hallway. He contacted associates in the Italian mob to learn what they knew about current developments in the Genovese-Costello conflict. He learned information that helped him understand both the immediate situation and the broader strategic context. Frank Costello had been shot on May 2nd, 1957. Actually, this was still in the future, but in this fictional timeline, let me adjust the date to early April 1957, before the actual historical assassination attempt. In this fiction, Genovese had not yet attempted to kill Costello himself, but had decided to target Costello's son first, believing that killing Michael would demonstrate Genovese's power and would create emotional devastation that would weaken Costello's ability to resist Genovese's takeover of the family. The two men who had pursued Michael Costello were Genovese soldiers who had been ordered to kill him at the first convenient opportunity. They had followed him to East Harlem and had been preparing to shoot him on 116th Street when Johnson's interference had prevented the assassination. They had withdrawn because killing someone under Bumpy Johnson's protection in Harlem would create complications with black criminal operations that Genovese could not afford, while simultaneously fighting Costello for control of the Italian mob. This information helped Johnson understand that his intervention had been more significant than he had initially recognized, and he had not simply prevented a random attack. He had protected Frank Costello's son from a calculated assassination ordered by Vito Genovese as part of a strategy to consolidate power. This intervention gave Johnson leverage that could potentially be used to influence the outcome of the Costello-Genovese conflict in ways that served Johnson's interests. But as Johnson thought carefully about the situation over the following hours, he began to recognize that the immediate question, what to do with Michael Costello now that Johnson had saved him, was less important than the systemic question about how the Costello-Genovese conflict affected Harlem's stability and Johnson's operations. The power struggle between Costello and Genovese had already created instability that affected Harlem. Soldiers from both factions were operating in the neighborhood, pursuing various agendas, sometimes creating violence that endangered community residents who were not involved in mob conflicts. The numbers operations that Johnson controlled required stable conditions. People needed to feel safe placing bets. Runners needed to be able to operate without fear of being caught in violence between warring factions. Collection routes needed to remain predictable. If the Costello-Genovese conflict continued escalating, it would create conditions where Johnson's operations would become increasingly difficult to maintain. If Genovese succeeded in killing Costello and consolidating power, he would likely attempt to renegotiate or eliminate the agreement that gave Johnson independence in Harlem. Genovese was known for favoring direct control over cooperative arrangements, and he had expressed interest in expanding into narcotics distribution in Harlem, which would conflict with Johnson's preference for limiting drug operations in favor of gambling that created less law enforcement pressure. Johnson recognized that he had an opportunity to use Michael Costello's survival as leverage to broker an arrangement that would serve Johnson's interests better than either a Costello victory or a Genovese victory. What Johnson needed was not for one faction to defeat the other, but for the conflict to end through negotiated settlement that established clear boundaries and stable arrangements that would allow Harlem operations to continue without interference from Italian mob power struggles. Over the next several days, as Johnson kept Michael Costello in protective custody in Harlem, Johnson began to develop a strategy for using this situation to create system-level change in how the Italian mob related to black criminal operations in Harlem. This strategy required understanding what various parties needed and how Johnson could position himself to provide value that would give him leverage in negotiations. Frank Costello needed his son returned safely. This was obvious and created the most immediate leverage. But Costello also needed something larger. He needed a way to end the conflict with Genovese that did not require either admitting defeat or continuing escalating violence that was attracting law enforcement attention and destabilizing operations. If Johnson could provide a framework for negotiated settlement, that would be worth more to Costello than simply returning his son. Vito Genovese needed to consolidate power without creating the kind of war that would bring federal prosecution. The recent Kefauver hearings had demonstrated that the government was willing to pursue organized crime aggressively when mob violence became too public. If Genovese started killing family members of rival bosses, it would create the kind of publicity that would force federal response. But Genovese also needed to demonstrate strength that would solidify his position. If Johnson could provide a framework that allowed Genovese to claim victory without requiring actual dominance, that might serve Genovese's interests. Johnson himself needed stable conditions in Harlem that would allow his operations to continue profitably. He needed the Italian mob factions to agree on boundaries that would prevent their conflicts from spilling over into Harlem in ways that disrupted numbers operations or created law enforcement pressure. He needed to establish his position as someone who could broker agreements between Italian factions, which would increase his status and influence beyond Harlem's boundaries. To develop this strategy into actionable plans, Johnson began building a coalition of people who could provide different forms of support and pressure that would make his proposed framework appear attractive to both Costello and Genovese. The first ally Johnson recruited was Thomas Bradley, an attorney who handled legal matters for Johnson's organization and who also had connections to Italian mob figures through various business dealings. Bradley's role would be to provide legal structure for any agreement that emerged from negotiations, creating contracts, establishing corporate entities if needed, ensuring that arrangements had enforceable elements that did not depend solely on mob honor. Bradley also understood both worlds, the Italian mob hierarchy and the black criminal operations in Harlem, which made him valuable as someone who could communicate effectively across cultural and organizational boundaries. The second ally was Meyer Lansky, the Jewish organized crime figure who had worked with both Costello and Genovese at various times and who valued stability over dominance. Lansky had enormous influence in the Italian mob despite not being Italian, partly because of his financial acumen and partly because of long-standing relationships with figures like Lucky Luciano. Lansky would benefit from ending the Costello-Genovese conflict because ongoing violence threatened the casino operations in Cuba and Las Vegas that Lansky had developed with Costello's cooperation. Johnson met with Lansky at a hotel in Manhattan and explained that saving Michael Costello created an opportunity to broker peace if Lansky would support the framework Johnson was developing. The third ally was Stephanie St. Clair, known as Madam Queen, who had been a powerful numbers operator in Harlem before Johnson took over operations in the 1930s. St. Clair had retired from active management but maintained influence in Harlem's community and had relationships with various political figures. And her role would be to build community support for the idea that Harlem should be recognized as territory where black operators maintained primary control, with Italian mob involvement limited to profit-sharing arrangements rather than direct management. This community support would make it politically difficult for Genovese to attempt direct control after any agreement was reached. The fourth ally was Malcolm X, who in 1957 was the minister at Temple No. 7 in Harlem and was building influence among black residents who resented both white political control and criminal exploitation of the community. Malcolm's inclusion in the coalition might seem contradictory. He opposed Johnson's numbers operations as exploitation of poor black people, but Malcolm recognized that Italian mob violence in Harlem created worse conditions than Johnson's operations, and that establishing clear boundaries that limited Italian interference would serve community interests, even if it also served Johnson's interests. Malcolm's role would be to articulate the position that Harlem's residents would not tolerate Italian mob factions using their neighborhood as a battlefield, creating public pressure that would make both Costello and Genovese want to avoid appearing to disrespect black community autonomy. With these allies assembled, and Johnson developed a specific strategy for creating pressure on both Costello and Genovese that would make negotiated settlement appear more attractive than continued conflict. This strategy had multiple components that would build pressure gradually over several weeks. The first component involved Johnson communicating to Frank Costello that Michael was safe, but that returning him required addressing the broader situation. Johnson had Thomas Bradley arrange a meeting with Costello at a restaurant in Midtown Manhattan. At this meeting, Johnson explained that he had Michael in protective custody and that Michael would be returned unharmed, but that the assassination attempt demonstrated the need for systematic resolution rather than just temporary protection. Johnson proposed that he broker a meeting between Costello and Genovese where they could negotiate boundaries and arrangements that would end the conflict without requiring either to admit defeat. Costello's initial response was skeptical. He wanted his son returned immediately and did not trust that Genovese would negotiate in good faith. But Johnson pointed out that the current trajectory, continued assassination attempts, escalating violence, increasing law enforcement attention, would end with both Costello and Genovese in federal prison while their organizations collapsed. The Kefauver hearings had demonstrated that the government had tools to prosecute organized crime when mob violence became too public. If Michael's assassination had succeeded, the resulting escalation would have created exactly the kind of publicity that would force federal response. Johnson also pointed out that he had leverage that Costello did not. Michael was safe in Harlem under Johnson's protection, but Genovese could not reach him there without creating a war with black criminal operations that would destabilize the entire city. This meant Johnson could maintain the current situation indefinitely if necessary, but it would serve everyone's interests to resolve the conflict through negotiation rather than through stalemate. Costello agreed to consider Johnson's proposal if Johnson would first allow Costello to speak with Michael to confirm he was unharmed. Johnson arranged a phone call, and after Costello verified that his son was safe, Costello agreed to participate in negotiations if Johnson could convince Genovese to participate as well. The second component of Johnson's strategy involved creating pressure on Genovese to participate in negotiations. This required different approach than what had worked with Costello, because Genovese was in a stronger position and was less motivated to compromise. The pressure on Genovese would come from multiple sources that would make continuing the conflict appear more costly than negotiating settlement. Meyer Lansky approached Genovese and explained that the casino operations in Cuba and Las Vegas required stability in New York, and that the Costello-Genovese conflict was creating instability that threatened these highly profitable ventures. Lansky indicated that if Genovese wanted support from Jewish organized crime figures for his casino interests, he would need to demonstrate that he could end conflicts through negotiation rather than through violence that attracted federal attention. This was financial pressure. Genovese's ambitions included expansion into legitimate and semi-legitimate gambling operations, which required cooperation from figures like Lansky, who controlled access to these opportunities. Stephanie St. Clair and Malcolm X created public pressure by organizing community meetings in Harlem, where residents expressed concern about Italian mob violence in their neighborhood. These meetings received coverage in black newspapers, creating publicity that embarrassed both Costello and Genovese by suggesting they could not control their conflicts without endangering innocent residents. This public pressure made both men want to demonstrate that they respected black community autonomy and that they would not allow their conflicts to create collateral damage in Harlem. Thomas Bradley approached Genovese through mutual legal connections and explained that the failed assassination attempt on Michael Costello had created a situation where any further attempts would need to occur in Harlem, which would require confronting Bumpy Johnson's organization. Bradley laid out the costs. Johnson had hundreds of men who could be mobilized if Genovese attempted to kill Michael in Harlem. The violence would attract massive law enforcement response, and the resulting chaos would destroy operations for both Italian and black criminal organizations. Bradley suggested that negotiated settlement would be cheaper and more effective than continued conflict. These various forms of pressure built over approximately 3 weeks in late April and early May 1957. During this period, Johnson kept Michael Costello in protective custody in Harlem, treating him well, but making clear that his safety depended on the negotiation process reaching successful conclusion. Johnson also continued his regular operations, demonstrating that Harlem's numbers rackets could function normally despite Italian mob conflicts, which reinforced the message that Johnson controlled conditions in Harlem and that neither Costello nor Genovese could simply impose solutions without Johnson's cooperation. By early May, both Costello and Genovese had agreed to participate in negotiations brokered by Johnson. The meeting was arranged for May 15, 1957, at a private dining room in a restaurant on 125th Street in Harlem. The location was significant. It was Johnson's territory, which meant he would be mediating from a position of strength. But it was also neutral ground relative to the Costello-Genovese conflict, which meant neither Italian faction could claim home advantage. The negotiation session began at 8 in the evening and continued until after midnight. Johnson facilitated the discussion, with Thomas Bradley providing legal structure for proposals, and Meyer Lansky participating as a third party who could verify that agreements aligned with broader organized crime interests. Johnson's framework for settlement had several key elements that addressed the interests of all parties. First, Genovese would be recognized as the boss of what would henceforth be called the Genovese family, giving him the title and status he sought. Costello would retire from active leadership, but would retain his business interests and would serve as an advisor, giving him security and ongoing income without requiring continued power struggle. This arrangement gave both men something they needed. Genovese got formal recognition of his position. Costello got peaceful retirement with dignity intact. Second, Michael Costello would be declared off-limits permanently. Any future attempt on his life would be treated as violation of the agreement and would trigger response from all parties to the negotiation, including Johnson's organization, Meyer Lansky's operations, and other figures who valued stability. This protection addressed Frank Costello's most immediate concern and established a precedent that family members would not be targeted even when conflicts arose between criminal organizations. Third, Harlem would be recognized as territory under primary control of black criminal operations, specifically Johnson's organization. The Italian mob would continue receiving profit share from numbers operations under the existing agreement that Johnson had negotiated with Lucky Luciano in 1935, but Italian factions would not attempt to manage Harlem operations directly or to expand into activities beyond the existing profit-sharing arrangement. This addressed Johnson's need for stable conditions and established his status as an equal partner rather than a subordinate operator. Fourth, both Costello and Genovese factions would refrain from violence in Harlem that would create law enforcement attention or that would endanger community residents. This addressed the concerns that Malcolm X and Stephanie St. Clair had raised about Italian mob conflicts spilling over into black neighborhoods. Violations of this provision would result in Johnson suspending profit-sharing payments, which created economic incentive for compliance. Fifth, disputes that arose in the future would be mediated through a commission that included representatives from both Italian and black criminal organizations, with Johnson participating as a permanent member representing Harlem interests. This created institutional structure that would outlast individual leaders and that recognized Johnson's status as someone who could broker agreements across organizational boundaries. These terms were debated extensively over the 4-hour negotiation session. Genovese objected to recognizing Harlem as territory under black control, arguing that the Italian mob should maintain the option of direct management if circumstances changed. Johnson responded that attempting to manage Harlem directly would require fighting his organization, which would be expensive and would attract federal attention that would destroy everyone's operations. Meyer Lansky supported Johnson's position, pointing out that the existing profit-sharing arrangement had worked successfully for more than 20 years and that there was no reason to change it simply to satisfy Genovese's preference for direct control. Costello objected to the requirement that he retire from active leadership, arguing that he should retain some formal position in the family. Genovese objected to Costello retaining any formal position, arguing that there could not be shared leadership. Johnson proposed the compromise that Costello would be recognized as consigliere emeritus, an advisory position without management authority, but with continued respect and ongoing income from business interests. Both men accepted this compromise as preferable to continued conflict. The debate over Michael Costello's permanent protection was less contentious. Both Costello and Genovese recognized that establishing precedent against targeting family members served everyone's interests by limiting how conflicts could escalate. Genovese agreed to the protection provision in exchange for Costello's agreement to retire from leadership, making this an element of the overall package rather than a separate concession. By midnight on May 15, 1957, all parties had agreed to the framework. Thomas Bradley drafted a written memorandum that outlined the terms, which all parties signed. The document was not a legal contract in the conventional sense. No court would enforce an agreement between criminal organizations, but it created a record that could be referenced if disputes arose about what had been agreed upon. The next day, May 16, 1957, Johnson arranged for Michael Costello to be returned to his father. The reunion occurred at Frank Costello's apartment at the Majestic on Central Park West. Johnson accompanied Michael to the apartment, where Frank Costello thanked Johnson personally for saving his son's life and for brokering the agreement that ended the conflict with Genovese. In the following weeks, the agreement held. Genovese assumed leadership of what became known as the Genovese family. Costello retired from active management, but retained his business interests and continued to be consulted on major decisions as consigliere emeritus. The Italian mob factions stopped conducting violent operations in Harlem, and the profit-sharing arrangements with Johnson's numbers operations continued without disruption. The most significant outcome was not the immediate resolution of the Costello-Genovese conflict, but the long-term change in how the Italian mob related to black criminal operations in Harlem. Before Johnson brokered this agreement, the relationship had been hierarchical. The Italian mob was understood to be dominant, with black operators functioning in subordinate roles. The agreement established a different model where Johnson's organization was recognized as having primary control over Harlem territory, with Italian involvement limited to profit sharing rather than management. This shift in power dynamics had implications that extended beyond Johnson's personal status. It created a precedent that influenced how other black criminal operators approached their relationships with Italian mob factions in other cities. When negotiations occurred about territorial boundaries or profit-sharing arrangements, The Harlem model that Johnson had established through brokering the Costello-Genovese settlement became a reference point that suggested black operators could negotiate from positions of strength rather than simply accepting subordinate status. The agreement also demonstrated that Johnson had capabilities beyond managing numbers operations in Harlem. He had shown that he could understand complex political dynamics within the Italian mob, could build coalitions across different criminal organizations and community institutions, could develop negotiation strategies that created value for multiple parties, and could broker agreements that addressed systemic issues rather than just immediate conflicts. At this demonstration of strategic capability, increased Johnson's status throughout New York's organized crime networks and created opportunities for him to participate in negotiations and decisions that extended beyond Harlem's boundaries. For Frank Costello, the agreement allowed him to retire with dignity and security rather than being killed or forced into exile. In the years following 1957, Costello lived quietly at his apartment on Central Park West, managed his business interests, and was consulted regularly by various mob figures who valued his experience and judgment. He maintained friendly relations with Johnson, occasionally meeting for dinner or to discuss developments in organized crime. The relationship between the two men was based on mutual respect that grew from the recognition that Johnson had saved Costello's son and had brokered a settlement that served Costello's interests better than continued conflict would have. For Vito Genovese, the agreement gave him the title and recognition he had sought while avoiding the extended war that might have resulted from continuing to pursue Costello violently. In the short term, Genovese appeared to have achieved his goal of controlling what became the Genovese family. But in the longer term, Genovese's ambitions led him into conflicts that Johnson had warned about during the negotiation. Genovese's insistence on expanding into narcotics distribution created the kind of law enforcement pressure that eventually led to his prosecution and imprisonment in 1959. His conviction on narcotics conspiracy charges demonstrated that Johnson's warning about federal response to mob violence had been accurate. For Harlem's community, the agreement created more stable conditions than had existed during the Costello-Genovese conflict. Italian mob factions stopped conducting violent operations in the neighborhood, which reduced the risk that community residents would be endangered by conflicts between criminal organizations. The recognition of Johnson's organization as having primary control over Harlem operations meant that community residents dealt with operators who lived in the neighborhood and who had incentives to maintain relationships with community institutions rather than with outside operators who viewed Harlem purely as a source of profit. Malcolm X continued to oppose Johnson's numbers operations as exploitation, but he acknowledged that the territorial boundaries established through the Costello-Genovese settlement represented an improvement over the previous situation, where Italian mob factions operated without regard for community concerns. The framework that gave black operators primary control created leverage that community leaders could use to negotiate about how criminal operations affected the neighborhood, which was better than having no leverage at all. Michael Costello, the young man whose near assassination had created the crisis that Johnson turned into an opportunity, maintained contact with Johnson over the following years. He pursued legitimate business rather than following his father into organized crime, and which Frank Costello encouraged as a way of ensuring that the family would not be vulnerable to future conflicts between criminal organizations. Michael's survival and his subsequent successful career in legitimate business demonstrated that the protection provision in the agreement had been effective and that the precedent against targeting family members had been respected. When Frank Costello died in 1973, Johnson attended the funeral. This attendance was noticed and commented upon by others in organized crime, as it demonstrated the continuing respect between Johnson and Costello that had developed from the events of 1957. By 1973, Johnson himself was elderly and in declining health. He would die in 1968, actually, so this timeline doesn't quite work. Let me correct. When Johnson died in 1968, Frank Costello attended the funeral, demonstrating the lasting respect between the two men that had originated in Johnson's intervention to save Michael Costello and his subsequent brokering of peace between Costello and Genovese. The story of how Johnson saved Frank Costello's son from assassination and brokered lasting peace between warring Italian mob factions became part of Harlem's oral history as an example of strategic thinking, creating outcomes that force could not achieve. The story was told with various embellishments and interpretations, but certain core elements remained consistent. Bumpy Johnson had prevented an assassination ordered by Vito Genovese, had used the situation as leverage to broker comprehensive settlement of the Costello-Genovese conflict, and had established precedents that changed how the Italian mob related to black criminal operations in Harlem. The legacy of this intervention was both immediate and long-term. The immediate legacy was the specific agreement that ended the Costello-Genovese conflict and established territorial boundaries that protected Harlem from Italian mob power struggles. But the longer-term legacy was the demonstration that strategic thinking and patient negotiation could create system-level change that benefited multiple parties. Johnson's approach to the crisis showed that power came not just from violence or from controlling resources, but from understanding complex situations and developing frameworks that addressed underlying interests rather than just surface positions. When Genovese ordered Michael Costello's assassination, and he was pursuing a narrow goal, weaken Frank Costello emotionally by killing his son, Johnson recognized the broader systemic issues, the instability that the Costello-Genovese conflict created for all criminal operations, the need for negotiated boundaries that would prevent future conflicts, the opportunity to establish black criminal operations as equal partners rather than subordinates. By expanding the scope of the negotiation from the immediate question of Michael Costello's safety to the broader question of how Italian and black criminal organizations related to each other, Johnson created value that made agreement possible. Both Costello and Genovese got outcomes that were better than continued conflict would have produced. Johnson himself gained status and influence that extended far beyond what his control of Harlem numbers operations would have provided alone. The coalition that Johnson built to create pressure for negotiation demonstrated how power could be assembled from diverse sources. Thomas Bradley provided legal expertise, Meyer Lansky provided financial pressure, Stephanie St. Clair provided community connections. Malcolm X provided moral authority, even though he opposed criminal operations. Each ally contributed something different, and the combination created leverage that none of them could have generated individually. The negotiation strategy that Johnson developed showed understanding of what different parties needed and how to structure agreements that gave everyone enough to make cooperation preferable to conflict. This was not manipulation or deception. Johnson did not promise things he could not deliver or conceal, costs that parties would only discover later. Instead, he clearly articulated what each party would gain and what each would need to accept, creating transparency that built trust, even in a context where trust was rare. The enforcement mechanisms built into the agreement recognized that criminal organizations could not rely on courts or legal systems to enforce contracts. Instead, the agreement created incentives and consequences that were embedded in ongoing relationships, profit-sharing arrangements that could be suspended if violations occurred, coalition partners who would respond collectively to breaches, reputational costs that would affect participants' status in the broader organized crime networks. These mechanisms worked because they aligned with participants' long-term interests rather than depending on short-term fear or immediate sanctions. Decades after the events of 1957, when people in Harlem told the story of how Bumpy Johnson saved Frank Costello's son and brokered peace between warring mob factions, they emphasized the strategic patience that Johnson had displayed. Johnson could have simply returned Michael Costello immediately in exchange for payment or immediate favor from Frank Costello. This would have been the simple, transactional approach that many people would have taken. But Johnson recognized that the situation created opportunity for systemic change if he was willing to invest time and effort in building coalitions and developing comprehensive solutions. At the 3 weeks between saving Michael and concluding the negotiation were weeks during which Johnson was taking risks. Genovese could have attempted to attack Johnson's operations in retaliation for protecting Michael. Federal authorities could have become involved if the situation attracted too much attention. Community resistance could have developed if residents concluded that Johnson was collaborating too closely with Italian mob figures. But Johnson managed these risks through careful communication, strategic coalition building, and constant attention to how different parties were responding to developments. The story taught lessons that were relevant not just to criminal operations, but to any situation involving negotiation and conflict resolution. It taught that saving someone created leverage that could be used for broader purposes. It taught that conflicts between powerful parties created opportunities for mediators who could develop frameworks that served multiple interests. It taught that coalitions built from diverse sources could create pressure that neither violence nor resources alone could generate. It taught that agreements needed enforcement mechanisms that aligned with participants' ongoing interests rather than depending on external authority. Most importantly, the story taught that some of the most significant exercises of power occurred through patient strategic thinking rather than through immediate confrontation. Johnson could have confronted the 2 Genovese soldiers who were pursuing Michael Costello, creating a violent conflict that would have had unpredictable outcomes. Instead, Johnson's simple intervention, standing between Michael and his pursuers without drawing a weapon, stopped the immediate threat while preserving options for future action. This restraint created space for strategic thinking that led to comprehensive settlement rather than just temporary protection. The framework that Johnson brokered in May 1957 established patterns that influenced organized crime in New York for decades afterward. The recognition of territorial boundaries, the profit-sharing arrangements between Italian and black criminal organizations, the commission structure for mediating disputes, all of these elements became standard features of how organized crime operated in New York. They were not invented by Johnson alone, but Johnson's role in formalizing them through the Costello-Genovese settlement gave them legitimacy and created precedents that other criminal organizations referenced when developing their own arrangements. When Thomas Bradley, who had provided legal structure for the agreement, reflected years later on the negotiation process, he emphasized that Johnson's greatest skill was understanding what people needed beneath what they said they wanted. Costello said he wanted his son back safely, but what he really needed was a way to retire with dignity. Genovese said he wanted control of the family, but what he really needed was recognition of his status. Johnson said he wanted stable conditions in Harlem, but what he really needed was recognition as an equal partner rather than a subordinate operator. By understanding these underlying needs, Johnson structured an agreement that gave everyone enough of what they actually needed to make cooperation possible. Meyer Lansky, who participated in the negotiation and who observed Johnson's approach, later told associates that Bumpy Johnson was one of the most strategically sophisticated operators he had encountered in decades of involvement in organized crime. Lansky noted that Johnson understood systems rather than just individuals, recognized that sustainable agreements required addressing underlying interests rather than just surface positions, and had patience to build coalitions and develop comprehensive solutions rather than seeking quick fixes that would create future problems. Stephanie St. Clair, who helped build community support for territorial boundaries, observed that Johnson's intervention in the Costello-Genovese conflict represented a turning point in how Harlem related to outside power structures. Before 1957, Harlem's relationship to the Italian mob had been hierarchical and extractive. After the settlement that Johnson brokered, the relationship became more balanced, with recognized boundaries and mutual obligations. This shift did not eliminate exploitation. Criminal operations still took money from poor communities, but it created leverage that community leaders could use to negotiate about how those operations were conducted. Malcolm X, who had provided moral authority for community resistance to Italian mob violence and maintained his opposition to Johnson's numbers operations, but acknowledged that the territorial settlement represented progress toward black self-determination even in the context of criminal activity. Malcolm noted that Johnson had demonstrated that black operators could negotiate as equals with white power structures when they had leverage and strategic clarity. This lesson was applicable beyond criminal contexts. It informed how Malcolm thought about civil rights negotiations and community organizing. For Michael Costello, whose near assassination had created the crisis that Johnson transformed into opportunity for systemic change, the experience shaped how he understood power and strategy throughout his life. In conversations with business associates years later, Michael would reference the way Johnson had turned a moment of extreme danger into leverage for comprehensive settlement. Michael observed that Johnson could have simply prevented the assassination and demanded payment, but instead Johnson had recognized that the situation created opportunity to address underlying systemic issues. This patient strategic thinking created outcomes that benefited everyone more than quick transactional solutions would have. The final aspect of the legacy was the precedent it established about protecting family members. Before the agreement brokered by Johnson in 1957, there had been no clear norm in the Italian mob about whether family members were legitimate targets during conflicts between factions. The assassination of competitors was accepted practice, but killing sons or daughters or wives had been less common, partly because it was seen as dishonorable, but partly just because it had not been necessary. Genovese's decision to target Michael Costello represented escalation into territory where norms were unclear. The agreement's explicit provision making Michael permanently off-limits established a precedent that family members would not be targeted even when conflicts arose between criminal organizations. This precedent was respected in subsequent decades and influenced how the Italian mob conducted its internal conflicts. When disputes arose between factions or when new leaders challenged established bosses, the conflicts generally focused on the principals rather than expanding to include family members. This restraint reduced the human cost of mob conflicts and created boundaries that prevented escalation into the kind of total warfare that would have attracted overwhelming law enforcement response. When historians and criminologists later studied organized crime in New York during the 1950s and 1960s, many noted the May 1957 settlement between Costello and Genovese as a turning point that established norms and structures that influenced how organized crime operated for decades afterward. Some credited Meyer Lansky or Frank Costello with developing the framework for settlement, but participants who were directly involved, Thomas Bradley, Stephanie St. Clair, and others, consistently pointed to Bumpy Johnson as the strategic architect who recognized the opportunity, built the coalition, developed the framework, and then facilitated the negotiation that produced comprehensive settlement. The story of how Johnson saved Frank Costello's son from assassination and brokered lasting peace between warring mob factions became one of the defining narratives of Johnson's career. It demonstrated that Johnson's influence extended far beyond Harlem's boundaries, that he could operate effectively in negotiations with the most powerful figures in organized crime, and that his strategic thinking could create systemic change that benefited multiple parties. The story was told and retold in Harlem and in broader organized crime networks, becoming part of the mythology that surrounded Johnson and that influenced how people understood his legacy after his death in 1968. The quiet nature of how the intervention began, Johnson simply standing between Michael Costello and his pursuers without drawing a weapon or making threats, became emblematic of Johnson's approach to power. Force was always available if needed, but Johnson preferred to create situations where force was unnecessary because strategic thinking and patient negotiation produced better outcomes. The transformation of a momentary intervention into a comprehensive settlement that changed how Italian and black criminal organizations related to each other demonstrated what could be achieved when intelligence and patience were used as primary weapons rather than violence and intimidation.